Welcome to Covenant Conversations. My name is Kyle Burkholder. I'm excited to have you here for week 3 of our Covenant Foundations series with Casey Andis, our discipleship director. This week, Casey decided to tackle creation and the fall. Those are two big, old topics and two big, important aspects of our faith. And so we're going to get into both creation and the fall. What does that even mean? Some of you are nodding your head going, I know exactly where we're going. Others of you don't know what those words necessarily mean in terms of faith. That's the perfect place to be, Casey. We'll get into all of that as we figure out both why does it matter and how does it impact our daily life. So without further ado, let's get into today's conversation. Welcome back to Covenant Conversations. I am joined again today by Casey Andis, our discipleship director here at Covenant Church. My name is, again, Kyle Burkholder, and we are into week 3 of Covenant Foundations, where we're kind of walking through some of the foundational theology, foundational doctrine of what it means to be a follower of Christ, how we get there, and why it all matters. So today it's week 3, and we are going to be tackling, Casey is going to be leading us in tackling creation and the fall. He figured neither of those topics was big enough. He wanted to put them both in the same week. So, Casey, will you give us an overview of what we're talking about when you say the words creation and fall for the uninitiated?
Yes.
What in the world are you talking about?
Yeah. So, it's really important, I think, in our faith to understand, like anything, right. We're all asking big questions of where did this originate? Like, where do we come from? And so really, when we're talking about creation and fall, we're talking about where did human life come from? But also, what does our faith have to say about the origin of life? And also, what does our faith have to say about the evil in the world? Those are two major questions that every culture has tried to address. And so we're going to be talking about what does the Christian faith say about that? And it's actually, and we'll see why, but it's really important for understanding of the rest of the Bible and how that affects us today. Okay.
So why do bad things happen to good people is somehow baked into this section. Is that what you're mean in a manner of speaking?
In a sense, the question definitely arises out of us talking about creation in the fall.
Yeah. Okay. Well, then get us started on creation. What is, biblically, what is creation? What do we need to know about it? What do we get wrong about it or over fixate on? Tell me more about creation.
Yeah. So I think the first question we have to ask is, what is the point of the creation story in Genesis 1? So in Genesis 1, that's where we see the origin, right? That's where we see God creating the universe. And so I think it's important in our modern times because of modern science, I would even say, even though these questions have been dealt with for years, but because of modern science, sometimes we are asking the Bible to answer questions that it wasn't trying to answer initially. And so we're not going to focus, we tend to focus on questions surrounding, was the earth created in 7 days or not, 7 literal days or not. And that's not what we're going to be dealing with in the study. Because I think the main point of the creation story, and not to say that we shouldn't try to find answers to that. So I will say that it's good for you to try to understand those things. But the main point of Genesis 1 is who created the earth. And so I think it's helpful for us to understand, remember, Moses is writing this to the Israelites who had just been enslaved to Egypt for 400 years, living under those pagan gods and pagan beliefs. So God is more focused on who created the earth, because the Egyptians believed a lot of different things about that, than how quickly he created it or how long. So that's what we're going to be focused on.
What are the pitfalls in thinking about creation? What are some of the things we get wrong? And then why does the creation story itself root so much of why is it the foundation of so much of what comes after it theologically?
Yes. So I think the biggest thing why it's important is understanding, and once again, you mentioned this in a sermon series, but if God created everything, and I think it's important for us to understand how easy it was when he spoke the universe into existence. And if he created everything, including us, then he has the authority over everything. And we get, as scripture goes on, it gets more and more revealed that Jesus is the creator and sustainer of all things. So not only did he create it, but he continues to sustain it right now. So I'm continuing to breathe because Jesus permits it. And so if he is the creator and he has authority over everything, he then gets to determine who we are.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where it really affects our faith today. And it affects even conversations that we're having today. All the different controversies that we have today. God is the one who has that authority. And so he's telling us who we are. And so the book makes a good point is if your identity is in what you do, your career, your intelligence, your athletic ability, or your sexuality, then you're thinking too small.
Mm-hmm.
And so I ask my kids this, what is our only hope in life and death? And they respond, we belong to God. So I'm trying to help them understand, like, ultimately our identity is that we belong to God, that he's our creator. So that helps us order our life because if he created it, he knows how we can live most joyfully, live according to the way we were designed. And ultimately, once we find out why he created us, then we can live fully into that design.
So you're describing a creation of God's good design and his wholeness and his shalom and his perfection. And the Genesis story of creation is just that God didn't make mistakes or create mistakes.
Yeah,
And yet what we encounter in the world around us is there's a bit of brokenness.
there is.
So that seems to imply that after God created, there was more to the story, and that might be where the fall comes in. Is that right?
Yes,
Okay, well,
absolutely.
walk us through that.
Yeah, so I think why the fall is so significant, right? We can swipe left on our iPhones right now, and there's going to be 4 different news stories on the brokenness of our world immediately. It's not hard for us to see that. So the world's broken, and ultimately, the Bible is rooting the brokenness that we see, not only the sin that we see, but even the brokenness in creation. Why are there tornadoes and hurricanes? Like the creation itself in Romans says it's groaning for its redemption, and it's because of sin is in the world. And so that's what we get into the account of the fall in Genesis 3 is
When you
we
say
see.
fall, define the fall. So
Yes.
if I've never heard that term
No,
before,
no,
I'm
it's
like,
good.
is this autumn? What are you talking about?
Yeah.
So what is the specific thing in Genesis where what we as kind of like
That's
jaded
good.
Christians, we just call it the fall? What does that actually look like? What is that story?
Yeah, so when God originally created the earth and he formed man and Adam and Eve, and they're in the garden, the earth was complete. It was perfect, right? It was good. There wasn't sin. Sin had yet entered the world, or had not entered uh, the earth at that time. And humans, Adam and Eve, they lived without shame. They were innocent. And so in Genesis 3, God gives them a prohibition. He says, do not eat of the tree of good and evil, right? Or the tree of knowledge. And they do. So, and I think what's interesting about that, when we talk about sin entering the world, it didn't happen through something that we would see as like this, all that controversial of a thing. They didn't murder someone. They weren't committing adultery. They maybe technically couldn't, but it wasn't this like shameful thing that we would think about. They simply disobeyed what God. They simply took what God had prohibited, and that's when sin entered the world, and everything began to fall, began to be broken, and then we really throughout the Bible, after that point, we just get this cycle of the same problem happening over and over again. God prohibits, he tells us how we're going to be blessed, and he prohibits X, Y, and Z, and we continue to reach out for X, Y, and Z, and we continue to sin against him. And even Genesis 8, you get the story of the flood before that. And then it didn't take long after the flood and after he had saved Noah and his family that sin happened again. And he said man's inclination was only towards evil. And that's a major, if we want to use a technical term, it's a major doctrine in the Christian faith, is ultimately we are not naturally good. Our inclination is towards evil. Jesus called his own disciples evil. That helps you.
What do we do with the concept of sin in a culture that is so relativistic, so as to say everything is fine, you live
Yeah.
your truth? What is that? Is that something that we need to be aware of, cautious of? How does that infect us, or maybe even allow us into greater sin? And should we have a higher view of sin when it comes to the way we live and walk through the world?
Yes, I think that's one of the biggest needs, not just in our culture, in our church. Um, we don't like to feel the weight of our sin, and so I do think if I went and asked the average Joe, have you sinned? They would all probably say, and I used to get this when I was in college ministry. They would admit to it. Yeah, they have no problem. Yeah, everyone makes mistakes. That's the common language I get. And so, right, when everyone makes mistakes, then nobody makes mistakes. Or they view sin as something like, hey, I tried, which it is this, I shot for perfection, but I didn't get there. And that is a part of what sin is. But the Bible has a much more expansive view of it. And so when we talk about sin, it's not just about, hey, I shot for this goal and I didn't quite make it. It's active rebellion. So for everyone in their life, and I try to help people with this, for everybody in their life, there's a point in your life where you were presented with an option. And you knew one option was good and right, and one option was bad. And we've all chosen, at some point in our life, we've all chosen the wrong thing, and we knew it. We knew it was wrong. We knew the options, and we chose to do it. And that's what it is. That's what sin is. God has prohibited something, and we've chosen to rebel. And that's why I keep using that language a little bit more. Is it's not just this, I accidentally made a mistake, which sometimes that happens, but it's actually active rebellion against who God is and what he wants for you.
So then these are clearly kind of massive, important, we would say foundational truths that we have to sort of try to figure out how to internalize. How do you make them practical for an everyday believer? If I'm talking about how should my knowledge or right belief in the creation and the fall, how would that change my daily life if I could hold those a little closer and just kind of have them meditate and consider them as part of my day?
Yeah. I think I'll start with creation. I think with that, it's part of it is a perspective change, understanding that, and remembering that, oh, I'm not the ultimate authority in my life. And that in itself, our culture hates that, right? I mean, that already pushes against the kind of the relativistic idea, and we use that language too. Like, what does it mean for me? And we have to be careful with that. And so I think some of it's just a perspective change of understanding, like, what does the Lord want from me today? And as Christians, and we'll get to this in the other podcast, as Christians, not because we're trying to gain God's approval. We have his approval. If your faith is in Christ, you have his approval. But there still is an aspect of doing things that please the Lord on a daily basis. And things that please him are glorifying him. And so part of it, I think, practically is, what does the Lord want from me today? Versus what do I want from me today? Or what does this other person want from me today? So that's a little bit more, I know it's not super hard practicality, but I think it starts there with creation.
It sounds like you're almost saying that a proper view of creation would create a humility in me, that I'm not the author of my days. I'm not God. And maybe that's enough for most of us, because the world would say we're in charge, make the world what you want it to be, take the world by the tail, whatever.
Right.
And what you just described sound like a great recipe for humility. And humility, as we see in the scripture, is a great recipe for finding faithfulness and favor.
Yeah.
Once we see ourselves rightly in view of who we're not, because we're not all that we want to be. We're not as in control as we want to be. And so maybe that's a great actual humility recipe. So I actually think that's super helpful and really practical.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it's about understanding when you shift to that framework, you automatically become dependent.
Right.
And that's what, I hear a lot of times, like, God's not going to give you more than you can handle. And I'm like, actually, he does all the time, because he wants you to rely on him. But we don't, and that's part of being humble, is relying on someone outside of us, which is where the sin comes in. Practically, is sin showed us immediately, and the Bible shows us over and over, we need someone outside ourselves to rescue us. And that's actually good news. So on one hand, God as creator pushes up against us because we don't like the fact that there's someone authoritative over us. But on another hand, there's a lot of relief you can get when you can just remember that God is creator and you are creation. There can be a lot of relief in that. And I think the other practical thing with sin is, there's a weird verse in the Bible that says Jesus entrusted himself to no man. And it's like, what does that mean? It sounds pretty cynical. But he knows what is in us, right? And we know what are in other people. It doesn't matter if you've been in, like, even in the church, right? We know that we are communing and we are living life together with sinful people. If we stop there, we would become cynical. But Jesus doesn't do that. So he's real. He lives in reality. They are a sinner, and Jesus knew that. Like, they killed him. So Jesus knew this, but he lived in the reality that they are a sinner, but he also lived in the reality that, especially if we're believers, that God's grace can change them. So we don't have to be surprised when people sin against us, but we also don't have to be cynical, and we can know that, hey, if they're in the Lord, he's going to change them over time and ultimately to look more like his son. So that gives us a lot of hope. So I think practically there, it can really change how we relate with people. We don't have to be so surprised when we're sinned against, and we can be more hopeful that the change can happen in them, and the same goes for us. We don't have to be so surprised when we sin against them, and we can be hopeful that God is changing us and will change us.
That was a great final word, as in creation and the fall and a right understanding of them are the gateways to humility and hopefulness. And I don't know anybody who wouldn't love to find more of that along the journey. So, Casey, thank you for this week and pouring into us. I'm hopeful in the weeks to come that we're going to get even more of this great Covenant Foundation study as you unpack it here in brief. And then, as we tell you every week, you can always join up with Casey. You can send him an email, casey@bgcovenant.org, if you want to be part of the next Covenant Foundations study that gets launched, and a real in-person discussion with all the deep diving and the heavy digging that goes into these big topics. So Casey, thanks for joining us today, and we will look forward to continuing the conversation next time.
You're welcome.